Paul. Good evening, everyone. So good to have you here with us tonight. This is the War Industry Resistance Network, and this is our 20th webinar. We've been around for over a couple of years, and we try to do one once a month. I know, 20 webinars, pretty good. So we're really happy tonight to have Ann Wright and Matt Ho with us to talk about the State Department as a tool of empire. And before we begin with our presenters, as usual, we'll have our colleague Paul Shannon give a few words about our network, and maybe we'll put some links in there too, so you can click on stuff that we have for you in terms of resources. So Paul, go ahead.
Okay, well, thanks, Ken. Nice to see everybody. We have couple of terrific speakers tonight. I know everyone wants to get into the webinar. I know I do, but I just wanted to quickly let you know what this War Industry Resistors Network is, because the growing power of our military contractors over all of our lives is becoming clearer each day. We're familiar, for instance, with the money that these contractors make. In fact, they are there wherever there is death and suffering, making a buck off of it, whether it's Yemen, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's Gaza. You can count on these guys being there. But beyond the weapons that they make and the money they make doing that, our webinars have exposed how these merchants of death drive our foreign policy itself, create the policies that lead to the situations where it is possible to make so much money. We have focused on how they shape our culture to make what they do seem normal. By documenting their influence over key think tanks, our universities, our media, our nonprofit world, as well as the US Congress and the executive branch, our network has exposed the sources of their power and bring these connections out into the open, where hopefully we can develop resistance to them. Our webinars, which I would encourage you to look at if you've missed any of them, I'm going to put a link in the chat where you can get these webinars. They show it is not an accident that we are a militarist society, constantly either involved in war or getting ready for the next one. Shaping our society in such a way is not an accident, it is by design. The War Industry Resistors Network is made up of small and larger groups, each focused on a war contractor in their region, focusing on educating people as to what these contractors are about and doing whatever can be done to try to curtail their activities. I'm going to put some contact information in the chat, all kinds of links to our website, to our, at least I think I am, yeah, to our website, to our webinar page, to our Facebook page. Everything you could possibly want is here. Why do this? Because we hope that you, if you are not yet part of this network, will want to get involved with us so that we can act together whenever that's possible. I will just point out that we have another very interesting webinar coming up on September 6th, and it's called Selling War with China, which is obviously a huge issue and getting more and more dangerous by the day. So I hope you will take advantage of these links, get in touch with us, get your own group going, focusing on your local war contractor. And I know I'm ready now to get to our two incredible speakers. Ken?
All right, thanks. Thanks a lot, Paul. So I may not have to give you a full introduction to Ann Wright and Matt Ho, because a lot of people know about both our presenters, but nonetheless, I'll read something to you in case you don't know about them. Ann Wright spent 29 years in the U.S. Army and Army Reserves, retiring as a colonel. In 1987, she joined the Foreign Service and served as a U.S. Deputy Ambassador in Sierra Leone, Micronesia, Afghanistan, and Mongolia. She received the State Department's award for heroism for her actions during the evacuation of 2,500 people from the civil war in Sierra Leone, at the time the largest evacuation since Saigon. She was on the first State Department team to go to Afghanistan and help reopen the embassy there in December 2001. Her other overseas assignments include Somalia, Kyrgyzstan, Grenada, Micronesia, and Nicaragua. In 2003, on the eve of the U.S. invasion of Iraq, Anne cabled a letter of resignation to Secretary of State Colin Powell, stating that without the authorization of the UN Security Council, the invasion and occupation would be a violation of international law. She was one of only 3 persons who resigned from the U.S. government in opposition to the Iraq War. Since then, she has been writing and speaking out for peace. She has an MA in law degree from the University of Arkansas, an MA in National Security Affairs from the U.S. Naval War College, and she's the co-author of a Dissent, Voices of Conscience. And Matt Ho is the Associate Director of the Eisenhower Media Network, an organization of expert former military and civilian national security officials who seek to reach broad, cross-partisan audiences in diverse media outlets and among the American people. Matt is a former Marine Corps captain, Afghanistan State Department officer, disabled Iraq War veteran, and senior fellow emeritus with the Center for International Policy. Matt's been a prolific writer, speaker about issues of war and peace. He's been a senior fellow with the Center for International Policy since 2010, has served advisory boards of many peace organizations, including Veterans for Peace and World Beyond War, is an associate member of Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, and was recently the North Carolina Green Party candidate for the U.S. Senate. And I voted for him. So welcome, everyone.
Thank you, Ken.
And Ann, over to you to get us started.
Well, thank you very much, Ken. It's a pleasure to be with everyone. And if I'd lived in North Carolina, I would have voted for you, Matt, also. It's a real interesting topic that we have. You know, the State Department as a tool of empire. Well, it sure is. It's the face of empire, really, in most countries, as U.S. embassies, of which I was a part of for 16 years, are kind of the face of the empire in other countries. And we pretty well know the duties of the Secretary of State as the face of empire. We see him every day as he flits around the world, and these days certainly causing, I think, more trouble than resolving issues. What I want to talk about in this is a facet of the State Department that really deals with the war industry. Most of the time, you don't really think that the State Department would really be part of the war machine, but it certainly is. It's an integral part of the war machine. And I'll just, let's see, let me see if I can get the little screen share going here. Let's see, we'll do this one and share, and then come on, share. There we go. And we'll do play from start. And we'll see if I have, look at that, pretty darn good. Okay, so here we are, State Department War Industry Resistors webinar. And there we go. Oops, let's go back here. The State Department, of course, is not the only U.S. government agency involved in the war machine. We all think of the Department of Defense, #1, but put old State Department #2, and also Treasury Department. They're part of the war machine. They put sanctions on countries. The Department of Justice is a part of the war machine. They're the ones that say, oh, it's okay. It's not against U.S. law to torture people. And the Congress is certainly a part of the war machine with its authorizations to conduct illegal wars. So we're adrift with all of our agencies that are a part of this. And it's a revolving door from people within the State Department and Department of Defense and other agencies that go from being ambassadors, for example, or senior members of the Department of Defense and all. And then they go right on into the war industrial complex through being on the board of directors of Northrop Grumman, Boeing, Lockheed, being on think tanks, that try to influence policies. Heritage Foundation, Brookings, CSIS, they all need jobs after their time in the government, and making wars has proven to be a very profitable thing. It's a very common thing, as we all know from our history, where the United States seems to get involved in conflict more than it helps resolve conflicts. So how does the State Department itself work on this military-industrial complex? Well, there's a office, the U.S. Security Assistance Program, which means security assistance, like helping other countries be secure, and our State Department's type of security, our government's type of security is military security, not real human security. So the U.S. government has this security assistance program that's really centered in the State Department, not the Department of Defense. There are programs that are run through the State Department called foreign military sales. Now, if that isn't part of the war industry, what is? So the State Department runs a foreign military sales organization. And according to their own data, 189 countries have foreign military sales programs. I didn't even think we had 189 countries in the world. And the U.S. doesn't recognize some countries. So it seems like virtually every country in the world has been buying or getting special deals on U.S. Military equipment. The way this process starts is at each one of our embassies. And we do have what are called now security cooperation officers. I love that term. Used to, it was just security assistance officers or military cooperation officers. Usually we have two military in each embassy, one that is an intel person, the defense attaché that is sneaking around getting intelligence about the government. The other one is security assistance, trying to figure out how the U.S. can become involved in the military by selling equipment and also by training its officers. Within the State Department, the Bureau of Political Military Affairs is the organization that runs this. In fact, I had a short-term assignment in the Bureau of Political Military Affairs. I disliked it so much that I volunteered to go to Somalia. That's how bad Washington is. Then after the State Department makes the decision really on what they think the U.S. government should have as a military program with the country, then the contracts are actually let through the Department of Defense, and they're the ones that actually execute, so to speak, the programs. But it all comes from the embassies and then the State Department to start with. And how much is this? Well, there's everybody's got to reinvent themselves. So there's a 10-point retooling. I love that. Retooling of the foreign military sales, which means how can we sell even more? How can we transfer even more weapons? 45 billion is what is annually made available to other countries. And most of the foreign military sales means that, yes, they have to buy it, but it's on special deals. The amount of weapons that we are selling, the United States is selling, grew in a short period of time by 49%. And part of that is the Ukraine war. Most of the time, these foreign military sales, all foreign military sales have to be approved by the Congress, and the Congress can approve them very, very quickly. 95% agreed to in a very short amount of time. There are another kind, besides this U.S. government program, foreign military sales, then there's also the direct commercial sales that don't go really through the government, other than the Treasury Department has to agree that it is not violating some U.S. law. But the State Department doesn't have anything to do with that. The congressional notification is really interesting. So for NATO countries, all 32 of them, plus the NATO partners like South Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and Israel, for any equipment over 25 million and services over 100 million, needs a 15-day congressional notification period. That gives Congress 15 days to decide yay or nay, but most of the time they decide within hours to go ahead and sell this stuff. For all other countries and for equipment over 15 million, as you can read here, it takes, they give the Congress 30 days. Now, if there have been human rights violations in the countries, that is supposed to be the trigger for the Leahy law, which says, no, we will not agree to sell any of this equipment. But the U.S. Kind of fudges things about human rights violations. And now it gets down to like maybe just the unit that supposedly committed the human rights violations. We can't give equipment or sell equipment that would go to that one unit, but we can sell it to all the rest of them. So the idea that really human rights violations is a slowdown point for U.S. military aid to countries is really not true. Now, in 2023, this year, just a kind of a look at where all of the sales have gone. And I didn't put down the exact amount that was sold. You can look this up. It's available online. If you just, and at the end of this, I've got some links where you can go and you can find out why Finland decided to buy something, and then why Romania, Germany, France, and then in June, there was a bountiful 12 countries were part of the foreign military sales program. In May, 7 of them. Ukraine pops up quite frequently, and there are things that are provided to Ukraine that are not really part of the foreign military sales. They are just outright gifts. So this is the U.S. weapons program, the war industry. And of course, with every one of these sales, it's a sale from Northrop Grumman, from Boeing, from the ammunition manufacturers, the missile manufacturers, all of these things. The U.S. is dominating global weapons sales, as you all probably know. But interestingly enough, in the last 4 years, our domination has gone from 33% of total global weapons sales up to 40%. So the U.S. is trying to sell and succeeding in selling more and more. And you look at Russia, it was in 2018, they had 22% of global weapons sales, but theirs is down to 16%. And then you see the other countries that make up the majority of the countries that sell weapons around the world. Now, what do these weapons do? Well, they sometimes are used in coups. And just to look at West Africa, 11 military coups in the last 20 years, 15 years. And the latest one is in Niger. The coup makers have been trained by the United States in what's called the International Military Education and Training Programs. The U.S. has been very soft on initially calling this a coup because the U.S. has military bases in Niger. We spent over $100 million to build one of the largest drone bases in the world, and we have 1,000 U.S. military that are in Niger. So the U.S. government's kind of treading lightly on this because of the investment we have in this country and the people that we train, the military that we trained, and supposedly we give training, although one would argue, well, let's look at Central America. What training did we give in Central America? How many coups has the U.S. been a part of in training militaries there? So the idea that our training is focused on human rights and democratically elected governments staying in power, that training module doesn't seem to have gone very far in our training process. Niger has a status of forces agreement with the United States, and that means the protection of U.S. military that are in Niger, that they will not be brought before Nigerian courts if they get drunk and run over somebody, that they will be able to be whisked out of the country by the U.S. military and then face military legal dealings. Of course, that's always a very painful subject, and particularly in South Korea, and Japan, where we have had all sorts of rapes, sexual assaults, and things like that. And U.S. military are spirited out of the country. Although one could say that that young man that's in North Korea right now, who had been in South Korean jail for assaulting people in a civilian bar, and then he somehow, pretty amazing that the military MPs in South Korea just let him go at the airport and told him to go to gate so-and-so and get on the plane to go fly back to Fort Hood, and the court martial will occur there. And that young man said, guess not. So he just hopped on the bus, got up to the DMZ, and then ran across the DMZ, and remarkably was not shot when he did it. And I think on today's news, it's that he is saying that, or the North Koreans are characterizing what he is saying, but I suspect it's probably true, that the military is a racist group, and certainly the United States has had its share of racism, and he's not too sure he wants to go back to the U.S. Anyway, that's what the latest North Korean communique is. Bottom line is a little bit of crunch here but it may mean that finally the U.S. and North Korea actually do some talking, which I think would be very good. We have had U.S. military sales to Niger. We've also in that region, Burkina Faso, Guinea, and Mali have all had military coups, and the ECOWAS, which is the regional security assistance group, has warned Niger that they would take military action to restore the democratically elected government. But the Nigerian military kind of waited them out on it, and the deadline was last week, and there's no military action. And that's kind of in contrast to the evacuation and coup in Sierra Leone in 1997, which I was a part of. Part of the Sierra Leonean military joined forces with the Revolutionary United Front, which was a bunch of thugs whose signature crimes of rape, pillage, and plunder, the signature was cutting off people's hands, arms, legs, ears, noses. And somehow they got part of the military that we had trained to join up with them. And this is the evacuation, some of the scenes of the evacuation of the 2,500 people from Sierra Leone. The diplomatic corps, senior or members of the Sierra Leone government that we felt were going to be harmed by the coup makers, and then a lot of other Sierra Leoneans that we felt were going to be harmed. The U.S. Embassy was closed for a year until the Nigerian military came in and in a military operation pushed the coup makers out of the peninsula on which the capital was. At the time of the coup in May of 1997, we had an international military and educational training team, an IMET team that was in Sierra Leone, and they were doing various kinds of training for one unit of that military. I can say, because I've investigated this very strongly, that unit did not have anything to do with the coup. However, they didn't apparently emphasize enough that coups were not a good thing. It wasn't that unit that actually perpetrated the coup, but it did join up with it later. The goals of this military education and training program is to train future military leaders, better understanding of the U.S., rapport, and in some countries enhance interoperability and capacities for joint operations. And that's really going on in Asia and the Pacific right now. Focus on professional military education. All of these things are the goals, but you can see from the numbers of coup and the people that the U.S. has trained that have been part of the coup machine that there needs to be a lot more emphasis on not doing coups. The U.S. embassies are the ones that select people for the military training. If the training is to be done outside of the local country, the United States sends various officers and NCOs to training in the continental United States. So over a long period of time, a person, the senior military leadership of a country, those people have had the opportunity to come to the United States for various types of training. And one would hope that that training would be something that would be of benefit to their local country and not by coup making. So with that, I will just mention these are some of the references that we have for the material that I have here, and I can put those in the chat. And I'll just end by saying I'm sitting in Hawaii right now, one of the most militarized areas of the United States. But the sovereign nation of Hawaii still is trying to get land back from the U.S. military. Speaking of land, we are in midst of a horrible tragedy with the fires, the burning of a small town on Maui of Lahaina, and homes that were burned up country in Kula. And I'll put in the chat if anyone would like to contribute to reputable organizations that are really doing a lot to help the people there. We are challenging the state of Hawaii and the U.S. government on the return of lands. There are 65,000 acres that were leased, 27,000 acres that were leased in 1965 for $1, and that lease is coming up in 2027. So we have programs that we are putting pressure on the state of Hawaii not to release these lands back to the federal government for military use, and we want the cleanup of areas that have been impacted by U.S. military operations. So with that, I thank you all very much. Keep up the great work, war resistors to military and industry, or whatever the name of this is. Anyway, you're doing a great job. Thanks so much.
All right, and thanks very much. War Industry Resistors Network.
There we go. Thank you.
Call ourselves WIRM, W-I-R-M. So thanks, Dan. That was great. A lot of good information there. And over to you, Matt.
Okay, thanks so much. And just to follow up on two things that Am was talking about. One with Maui, the fires there, militarized state, probably per capita or by square miles, the most militarized state in the country. The helicopters that were being utilized to fight the wildfires, of which, as far as I could tell, only 4 were available, probably because they only had 4 buckets to do it. Those buckets hold about 200 gallons of water. I don't know if F-15s are still based on Oahu or not, but the equivalent for an F-15 would be 2,700 gallons of water in terms of its payload. So if you just look in terms of the material, the resources, what we put into war fighting, war making, into the war machine versus what we invest in protecting our own people, the disparity is there. And who knows, maybe at some point we'll get our heads together and we'll convert the B-2s, the B-1s, the B-52s, right, the F-35s into carrying water to fight these wildfires as opposed to carrying bombs. We'll see. I don't know. Ann was talking about how the great growth in weapon sales that goes through the State Department, beginning in the Obama administration, accelerates under Trump, and certainly Biden trying to outdo his predecessors. And when that happens, it takes away from the other functions of the State Department. So it's not as if the State Department now has its marching orders to sell more weapons, but keep doing everything else. We're going to give you more people to do that. No, to do those weapon sales, they need to take from other sources. And I'll get into this a bit in my talk about, if you're going to be a war maker, if you're going to be part of the war machine, you're not going to be able to do the diplomacy. And what I saw, a personal anecdote, I have a family member who was a human rights officer within the State Department, and she was the human rights officer for the South Central Asia Bureau. And at the end of the Obama administration, I think there were 5 people total, including her, on the human rights team for South Central Asia. South Central Asia, of course, being the Central Asia stands, India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, right? I mean, so those are the nations that fall under that remit. And as this shift to increasing weapon sales went, well, we need people to do it. So her 4 or 5 person team steadily got depleted until at the point about 2019 or so, where that 5 person team for human rights for that bureau was now 1 person, her. And where did those other team members go? They went to political military affairs to sell weapons, right? To sell F-35s and Tomahawk cruise missiles and whatever else. So, but what I'd like to talk about tonight is the role that the State Department plays as a tool of empire through 3 different types of lenses, through contracting, through policy, and then through being an appendage of the body of war, right? Through its role in the actual mechanics of war fighting. And so, we talk about the contracting, you're talking about the budgets and everything else, and this is separate from the foreign military sales, the weapon sales, the actual money that the State Department spends on vendors, okay? And what you see, of course, when you compare it to the Department of Defense is there's no comparison. The Department of Defense has a lot more money than the State Department does. And when I say State Department from here on out, unless I differentiate, it includes USAID, the Agency for International Development, so the United States Development Arm. A lot of times they're separated, sometimes they're put together. If you know the history of those organizations, there's a lot of they don't like each other a lot of times. But if you look at the FY23 budgets, compare DoD to state. DoD's budget in 2023 was $857 billion. State Department's was 59.7. FY24 expected. DoD's is $886 billion. State is $63.1 billion. When you look at the wars in terms of the spending, the direct spending on the Iraq and Afghan wars, this comes from the Cost of War project up at Brown University. So of the $2.3 trillion we spent directly on the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, about 169 billion of that went to the State Department and AID and other international affairs programs. And so while it's not nearly the bulk of that spending, $169 billion is still a lot of money, right? It's much more money than we spent on education, on on our infrastructure, on research and development, on all sorts of things. The numbers I just gave too as well for 2023 and 2024 do not include the Ukraine supplementals, which I'll get into in a moment. Half of I want to show one slide just to give you an understanding of how big the DoD budget is compared to the other agencies. So bear with me 1 minute. And this here is from FY 2020. My apologies, I couldn't get anything more recent that graphically showed just how big the Department of Defense is when it comes to the amount of money it spends on contractors, right? So this here, 665.1 billion in the center there, that's a total amount of money that the federal government spent on contractors, on vendors in 2020. And then you see of that number, 421.8 of it came from the Department of Defense. And as we know, half of that goes to just the big 5 arms contractors, something I'm assuming you guys have spoke about before. And if you look over here in the other in the civilian federal agencies, you see over on the left there, kind of about 9 o'clock you'll see the Department of State about $9.3 billion a year in contracts in 2020. From what I can find this year in 2023, that's about $13.5 billion, although that is technically all not contracts in the sense of you'd think of contracts as money going to vendors to perform a service, right? So roughly half of that actually is money that goes as financial assistance, grants, loans, other forms of payments to non-U.S. entities that are not considered contractors, so governments per se. But certainly, what I'm getting at, though, is even though the dollar amount is relatively small compared to DoD, it supports a development industry just as you have a military industrial complex. So my argument would be, of course, our good friend Ray McGovern, his thing is that we shouldn't be saying military industrial complex, right? We should be saying MICI-MAT, which is military, industrial, congressional, intelligence, media, academic think tank. And I would argue that we should put in development in there as well, because what you see, as I said before, about how half of the DoD contracts go to just 5 firms, 5 companies, you see the same thing too in USAID's USAID's spending. Half of their contracts go to 6 development companies. Right. So they have the same type of formation of a complex as well that does all the same things that the military industrial complex does in terms of advocating for itself, lobbying, having a presence in media, et cetera. This leads into the other point of the contracting that is so important to understand is how it becomes a jobs program, how it provides for much more manning and staffing and people to these agencies in a way that's not authorized by Congress, as a way to get around federal law, a way to get around oversight. We'll get into transparency in a minute about how this helps keep things secret. But what you see with DoD, according to the Congressional Research Service, the Department of Defense employs about 250,000 contractors a year. Okay, to give you just a reference of scale, the United States Marine Corps is about 180,000 Marines. So there are vastly many more contractors working for the Department of Defense than there are Marines. It was very difficult to find any type of number for contractors in terms of State Department and USAID. I couldn't find anything that was worth even bringing up in front of you all because it just seemed all so shaky and fuzzy. Again, this will get into the transparency aspects of this. What I did find is that 2 years ago, as the United States was retreating from Kabul and all these people had to be evacuated from Afghanistan, USAID and the State Department could not say how many people they had as contractors in Afghanistan. They simply didn't know. Gives you an idea not just of how big it is, but also to the desire for no transparency, but also to the mismanagement. So when we think about the mismanagement, the fraud, the waste, the abuse that goes into the war industry, right? The $600 hammers and $5,000 toilet seats and those types of things. You also think about the fact that you can't keep track of how many people you're employing. You don't know who they are and where they are. So you can see how that is just purely a fundamental aspect of the racket that the war industry utilizes for its benefit. So this aspect of transparency, that leads to secrecy. And I'm sure Anne might be familiar with this as well. But when I was around these folks, you'd hear these comments about, this question of what is the most secretive organization in the United States government? And you'd think, well, the CIA. But the thing is what they would say is that, no, it's USAID. And there's a couple of different aspects of this, how this lack of transparency aids in a number of functions. One, by using the contractors, just as the Department of Defense does, just as the intelligence community does, it causes a degree of obscuration. Because by using contractors, they're not official government employees. And you run into all types of oversight problems, whether it be on a judicial level, whether it be a legislative level, whether it be a fiscal level. I think the best example I can give you is, it's still ongoing, this idea of people who were tortured by the firm Khaki, the contracting firm Khaki, who were tortured by Khaki in Iraq. So Iraqis who were suing in federal court to have some type of justice for the crimes committed against them. This has been going on for about 15 years now, I think. It's now in its 18th appeal process. Basically, what has happened in that is that U.S. courts have said, because Khaki, even though they are working for the U.S. military at the time, they were a federal contractor, and they were doing the work of the government, because it wasn't in the United States, there's no oversight, there's no accountability, there's no jurisdiction. So what you have is, when you have these contractors working for you, you have a lot less oversight, as well too as for the media, where you can file a Freedom of Information Act request to the State Department, to USAID, to DOD. There's no such process if you're dealing with a contractor. Contractors doesn't have to open their books just because you submitted the correct forms to them. So there's all types of transparency. You're able to, you're able to cover up things and make things hidden and make some things obscure. And this, of course, I think leads to probably a thing that most people are familiar with: the State Department being a part of the war machine in terms of the policy of war, is the use of the CIA through the State Department, through AID. This is nothing new. As long as embassies have been around, spies have been throughout those embassies. But what you certainly see is, you see the State Department and AID not just performing cover for the CIA, but also facilitating by using their programs, their contractors, to do those types of missions. People who want to know more about this, I refer you to Chris Hedges' work, his investigations of AID, the role AID played in Central America, supporting the U.S. efforts there in those terrible wars and those terrible atrocities. One of the things that filters out over this then is the role of democracy promotion. Right. And now we start getting into some of the specific organizations that work for the State Department, such as the National Endowment for Democracy, the International Republican Institute, the National Democratic Institute, which are all private organizations, even though they receive almost all of their funding from the federal government. And this is something I think many of you are familiar with. NED, the National Endowment for Democracy. It has been every place there has been a coup the United States has been been a part of in the last 30, 40 years. And it is actually a non-governmental organization. So it doesn't have to open its books for anyone, even though it gets almost all its money from the U.S. Congress. And NED, IRI, NDI, a host of others fill this role for the State Department and for IAD, often alongside of the CIA, to do this quote unquote democracy promotion. Again, there's a lack of oversight there. It's a lack of accountability, helps hide things, and we can certainly get into this more. My role with the State Department, where I come from with this experience, is my role in the wars, my taking part in the wars. And so I was on part of 2 U.S. embassies at war. I was a Department of Defense official, a civilian official in Baghdad from 2004 to 2005 with the U.S. Embassy in Iraq. And then in Afghanistan, I had been appointed into the Foreign Service, and I was a political officer in Afghanistan. So I saw the wars and how the State Department contributed and was a part of the war machine. As well as back in DC, I was on the Iraq desk as a contractor. We were called consultants, but we were contractors. And so I saw how that whole process worked from the inside as well, primarily how the State Department, as a tool of empire, did not serve its diplomatic purpose. It did not provide an alternative to war making, rather it provided a supplement to the war making. And very often you would see that the civilians who come out of these agencies, who should be arguing the loudest against going to war very often are the loudest cheerleaders for war. And there's a number of reasons for that. Some of it has to do with maintaining a relevance, right? You don't want the Department of Defense getting all the credit, getting all the attention. No one is paying attention to you, as well as then you have real no say. No one is going to listen to the ambassador if there's a 4-star general who has a lot more authority. So you want to be involved with all of that. You want to be involved in order to maintain your own relevance and make sure you have a primary seat at the table, so to speak. The other thing too is the money. You know, these wars were cash cows. This was the feeding trough. This was the gravy train to be on. And so what you see then is you see almost any State Department or AID grant proposal during the Iraq and Afghan wars always had in its purpose, its statement, its, whatever its explanation, it always had the words counterinsurgency. Right. So what you saw was AID and state really jump wholeheartedly into this role as war maker. It comes out of this idea of soft power, but that certainly expands, and you see it becoming a part of war making in the sense that, well, just to say it this way, we had this doctrine, this theory that we operated with of money as a weapon system. And so if you're going into a country like Iraq or Afghanistan, you're following these counterinsurgency tenets that you're supposed to be connecting the people to the government, and you have this money. And of course, in AID's case, you supposedly have this expertise to do development, to do reconstruction. Well, you're in a prime position to have yourself a seat at the table, to be relevant, and to get a lot more money. And that's what we saw. And certainly you had this rush, like a gold rush in Washington, D.C. in 04, 05, 06, to be a part of all that money that was going to be pouring into these wars. Because remember, these wars weren't supposed to last a long time, right? According to Don Rumsfeld and Paul Wolfowitz, I saw these documents when I was at the Pentagon. By end of summer of 2003, we were supposed to have been down to 25,000, 30,000 troops in Iraq. That was it. These wars weren't supposed to last a long time, but once they did, and once everyone stood it, again, it was a rush to make sure you were at the table. And so the State Department and AID were right up front to make sure they were. What they also do as well is they validate the war. They give the war a deeper meaning or a deeper purpose. When the State Department, when your diplomats are fully involved in the war effort, not just making statements on television like Secretary Rice or Secretary Kerry or Clinton would have done, but being on the ground, right, in the Humvees with the soldiers, attending the local provincial council meetings. These are all things that I did, right? It gives a degree of legitimacy. It validates the war and the effort and the supposed purposes behind the war. With that, then, as I said before, if you have that role, if that's what state is playing, if that's what your diplomats are playing, then who is going to do the argument for peace? Who is doing the argument for diplomacy? Who is doing the argument for negotiations? And so you saw this process where state was very happy they would call themselves an equal, but they certainly weren't, but very happy to fall under the wing of the Department of Defense, or maybe be more generous, just to become a arm of the body of the war making, right? And I mentioned before about the supplementals and how much money were involved in this, and how much of that money then went into the State Department, right? And went into USAID. So you have their regular budgets. And so for this year, like I said, the budget for the State Department is about $60 billion. But if you look at the Ukraine supplemental funding, so far we've had $113 billion appropriated by Congress for the war, and now we're looking at maybe another $24 billion. Well, of that original $113 billion, you've had about $45 billion of that be money that the State Department would administer. through economic programs, right? Through whatever type of infrastructure programs, facilitation of the Ukrainian government, again, democracy building, things like that. And of the new round of funding, which we just heard about, which I'm sure everyone else is sick to their stomach, and you don't think you can get any angrier or more disgusted or more upset by our government. And then our government goes and says, well, you know what, if we want to see this money get to Maui, as well as to all those other places around the country that have been devastated by drought, water, wildfires and tornadoes and floods, you're going to have to vote for the money for the Ukrainian army as well. I mean, I'm sitting here in North Carolina. We're about to go into hurricane season. It's supposed to be an above normal hurricane season. And, you know, our members of Congress are going to be told, if you want to make sure FEMA has the money to support North Carolina, if you guys get hit by a hurricane, you better vote for this Ukrainian weapons spending. But of the $24 billion that are going to go to Ukraine in terms of funding, of that, 13 billion will go to the military, but then another $6.5 billion will go for economic assistance, again administered through the State Department and AID, and another 3.8 billion won't even go to Ukraine, but will go to other nations around Ukraine in order to, because as a justification is to fend off coercive Chinese lending. But what you see, though, is you see the role of the development industry in all this, making sure that they are getting there. So of that 10 billion or so in this new $24 billion round, half of that is going to go to the big 6 development contractors, right? So very similar phenomenon that you see with the military industrial complex. So, you know, I just want to, I know that was a lot. I know that was broad. I wanted to get those kind of 3 things out there to get people to think about how state serves a role as a tool of empire. You know, just to kind of reiterate, it's not nearly as large as DOD in terms of money, but it is substantial. You know, it has its own development industry complex. So I'll ask Ray, you know, to somehow insert a D into his Mickey Matt. I'll give him you know, it'd be a good thing to see if it can work out. You know, it plays a mechanically useful role in the wars because it's filling out its embassies, it's doing regional embassies, provincial reconstruction teams. It's bringing in under its umbrella people who are doing all supposed reconstruction and political work. It allows for spies to be there, intelligence officers to be there. But then also, too, it fills out that arm of the counterinsurgency doctrine, which was so important for our political leaders, for our military leaders, and for our media to sustain the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. You couldn't have done that unless you had a robust civilian presence in those wars that were led by the State Department. And then when you see all this, it gets back to that idea of then who's doing the diplomacy, right? If you're doing the war making, if you're part of the war fighting, who's doing the diplomacy? And of course, the idea then is that nobody is. And it gives validation to the war making, it gives legitimacy to it, and you know, serves a very harmful role towards any type of diplomatic efforts, any type of peace efforts, but also, too, it really does a disservice to the American people. I'm happy to talk about my experiences, what I saw, how things actually were filled out on the ground, how the State Department actually conducted itself, how it saw itself, you know, as a supplemental effort to the U.S. military, as well as, you know, anything else you all would like to talk about. But, you know, thank you all so much for joining me and listening to me. And thank you all for putting this on.
Well, Matt, thank you. And geez, that was a master class. I'll tell you what, you had a lot in there. I'm gonna have to go back and watch the recording of this again. And by the way, everybody, we are recording, and we do send the recording out after, you know, in a follow-up email I'll send you. You'll get the recording of this, so not to worry about that. Thank you, Matt. I wrote down one quote from you. I could have written down a whole bunch. But the State Department's not an alternative to war making; it's a supplement to war making. That is well said. And
we certainly saw ourselves that way. You know, I mean, I was coming out of the Marine Corps, so I was disposed to do that. But certainly, Many in the state in AID saw themselves that way. They were happy with that role. But to be honest, there are also many who dissented from that, didn't like it. But the way it worked was they always had enough people to put in those roles. So it went along, and I sat in a briefing one time in 2005 at the State Department where the USAID administrator came in and gave a briefing about what they were doing in Afghanistan. And literally, I swear the briefing was, if you all want more money for Iraq, this is what you want to do. She was giving a briefing on the role of the provincial reconstruction teams in Afghanistan, which, point of fact, the State Department was already doing in Iraq, had been doing, but they weren't phrasing it correctly. It was seen as an alternative to the military, not as a supplement, not as, the left fist to the right or whatever, however you want to describe it. But yeah, so it really was, there was this, it was the gravy train. It was the cash cow, it was a trough. And it was recognized that way. And then, once, as you all can understand, once that gets steam underneath it, it's a living being of its own.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so we're going to switch gears here a little bit. We're going to go to Q&A, but before we do, what we've started to do with our webinars is add in a little action component for each webinar that we do, and just take a few minutes to ask you to fill out a form and send a message into your congressmen and congress people and senators. And to lead us through that, I'm going to ask Brian Garvey to talk to you for a second and get us going on this. So. Go ahead, Brian.
Thanks, Ken, and thanks to Matt and Ann for their wonderful presentations. I'm looking forward to the Q&A. I won't keep you long, but here is a quick action that you can take since the subject of tonight's webinar was the State Department and their role in this. I thought we should put together an action on the war in Yemen. And the State Department's role. The latest that we have heard is that the Special Envoy, Timothy Lenderking, is doing some things to sort of drag his feet and even delay the peace negotiations to get better terms for Saudi Arabia and their allies. Of course, this is very concerning to us. We've been working on the war in Yemen for years and years. It for a long time was the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. The blockade that caused and is causing so much devastation is continuing by land, by air, and by sea. About 75% of Yemen's population is still in need of food aid. It just shows you how dire the situation is there. Over the course of that war, some 400,000 people were killed. Reason to believe that most of those were civilians, women and children. So if you click on the action that I just put in the chat, all you have to do is type in your address and it will send a message to your senators and your member of Congress telling them to basically make a stink out of this, to raise up the issue, to say that even though hopefully the war in Yemen is winding down, we have not forgotten about this issue. And we want the State Department to get out of the way and to fully endorse the peace negotiations that are going to end this war once and for all. We're very close. We're in the midst of a ceasefire that has lasted now over a year. And we do not want this war to resume. We want peace negotiations and an end to this U.S.-Saudi war in Yemen once and for all. So, thank you for all of those who have taken the action already. I'll put it in the chat one more time. Just takes a minute to do. I appreciate you in advance.
Thank you, Brian. Would you stand up a little bit and let everybody see your shirt?
Sure.
Oh, there you go. We have those shirts if you would like to have one. A mere $20 to the cause. So, yeah, thanks, Brian.
I didn't think yellow was my color, but I love it.
Very good.
Ken, there's a phone number in the in what I pasted in earlier.
I just
Contact information. You can call to order one of those T-shirts. I know everyone is jealous looking at Brian's wearing that during the webinar. So I know everyone wants their own shirt. So please put in your orders.
So in terms of that accent, Brian, you've really got that slick as a whistle right now. It took me didn't even take me 30 seconds to fill it out and send it in. So if you all can do that, that's nice. Okay, we're going to move on to Q&A here, and we're running long on this webinar, maybe as we should, because it's such an important topic. And the way we do it is you can see 3 people already have their hands raised. You go to your reaction button. On my screen, it's down below, reactions. And one of the choices you can do to react is to raise your hand. So we then take people, one at a time. And I am going to ask, and I actually will facilitate that people don't talk on and on, right? We have had cases where people come on and, they want to give their talk or their speech as well. But please, what we'd like you to do is if you have a comment, you make it brief. You ask a question and we have our presenters respond to it. We'll go longer than normal tonight. We usually go for an hour, but it looks like we might go for an hour and a half if Ann and Matt, if you're up for that. Actually, I want to ask the first question. I haven't done this for this 20th webinar we've had, and I've never done this, but I'm going to do it just this one time. And that is to ask Ann and Matt to respond to the idea that I mentioned to somebody the title of this webinar being State Department as a Tool of Empire, and they say, well, they always have been. Look at John Foster Dulles, and it's not just Blinken and now Newland, it's been straight on down the line for the history of the thing. It's been, a complement to war, not just an alternative to it. Now, maybe you don't agree with that, Matt and Ann, I don't know, but would you make at least a little comment about it?
Yes.
Yes, you do agree.
Yes. No, I think the history is right there. I mean, ever since the U.S. started acquiring, empire, the State Department's been right in the middle of it the whole way. In fact, some of the acquisitions of the empire were named initially for secretaries of state, for God's sakes.
Okay, good. Thanks. Anything, Matt, to add?
Yeah, I think it goes back pretty far, right? Where this notion that embassies' primary thing was commerce, whether making sure our ships could go into ports and sell our stuff or buy stuff, or, even the role of an embassy of bailing out drunken sailors, right? Because you don't want that ship to get stuck in port, right? That's bad for business. So certainly has a long reach. I think where you start to see the insidiousness, the real danger of it, and certainly the American empire stretches back centuries, and we can get into the U.S. role in Central and South America, in Americas and everything else, and then but this idea of it being the tool of empire, it being an enabler for a militarized foreign policy, really under Dulles. The Dulles brothers, one at State and one at CIA, you see that become very sharpened. And of course, you go back and you look at who are their clients. Where do these guys come from? These guys were lawyers for Wall Street banks, right? And so you understand that commercial aspect that was underpinning all of it.
All right, good. Thanks a lot for that. So I can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 hands raised. And that's probably going to take us out. That's probably going to be as many as we can accommodate in a half an hour, and we'll see. And often I go from left to right. Maybe tonight I'll go from right to left. How about Elizabeth Fatah? Is it Fatah? You want to go first? Please go ahead. A comment, question for our presenter.
Well, I put a question in the chat, and that is about Pakistan. How we've seen that I guess a military person leaked that someone from the American embassy had contacted the military and said, we don't like this prime minister or president, I don't know which they have there, and so he's gone. He's almost arrested. And that had been not on the main news, of course, but it's been on The Intercept and something else. And so I would like you to have comment about that.
Well, I'm not shocked.
Yeah.
Yeah, nobody is shocked. Nobody is shocked.
I mean, you look at Victoria Nuland, where at
Yeah.
least there's all you can point to where she's
Yeah.
advocating regime change in Ukraine in
right.
2016. And behind the scenes, there certainly are plenty of sorry. Sorry, let me turn that off. Plenty of times where U.S. government officials have indicated what they want to happen in a country, and it's happened. And you
Right,
look, Allende being killed in
yeah, I know.
Guatemala. So, it's a terrible part of our legacy, the U.S. government's legacy of orchestrating regime changes.
Right, yeah,
Okay,
Yeah, I mean,
thanks,
so-
Matt.
thank you.
Yeah, just a thing from my own experience in 2010 and 2011, I did a bunch of I met with the Dutch intelligence folks a number of times, because if people remember back then, the Dutch had gotten out of Afghanistan. It created a crisis in the government fell, the conservative government wanted to go back in. The Dutch intel people were just adamant, this is insane, don't do it, we're jumping back into quicksand. Anyway, so I was over there talking to them quite a bit, or a number of times, and they told me that the U.S. Department of State, the embassy, communicated to the Dutch government very clearly, if you do not go back into Afghanistan, if you don't jump back into that quicksand with us, we are not going to send our ships through Rotterdam anymore. So there's that type of threat, right? And that's what we saw with about what happened with Imran Khan in Pakistan, was that first of all, if anyone thinks that it was only that one time that such a thing was said to the Pakistanis, that's just the one that's on paper kind of thing, right? Yeah, but if you get rid of him, things will go really well. If you don't, things will go really badly. So kind of showing both the carrot and the stick. Yeah.
Right.
All right, thank you, Elizabeth. And so Tarek Kauf, I see you there. Are you ready? Our friend Tarek Kauf, you want to ask a question, Tarek?
Yeah, I had to grab my cat because it was biting me, wanted attention. So, Matt, first of all, thank you both. What happened?
You're fine.
Okay? Yeah, great. First of all, Anne and Matt, you guys are fantastic, and I love your sense of humor also, which is great. In response to Ken, and thank you, Ken, for doing this. It's terrific. Yeah. Anyway, I want to ask Matt particularly a question. Now, I know Matt for a while now. We've done stuff together, and I have the highest regard for him, and I love his mind and his soul and the whole deal. I just totally respect it. And of course, you too, Anne, you know that. But here's what I want to ask you. When you talk about being in the State Department in Afghanistan, Iraq, and then you were in the Marines, and you had a different mindset back then. You must have had a totally different mindset to be doing that. So when did it start to switch? Because it's a huge switch. You're a revolutionary now. You were part of the system. That's a big switch. Now, Anne is a long time thing, but and I could ask Anne the same question. But how did that switch? Where did it start to happen? It's a phenomenal change, So can you talk about that a little bit? Do you mind?
No, I don't. And it was always with me. There was always a duality with me, so I'm in high school and I'm applying to West Point and ROTC scholarships, and I get in, and then I'm a senior in high school in 1990, 1991, and the Gulf War is going on, and I'm just absolutely appalled by it. And I decide not to go to West Point, not to take an Army ROTC scholarship, because so appalled by the first Iraq War. I go to college and then I graduate and I'm bored. And it was post Cold War, a new world order, et cetera, et cetera. But I end up in the Marine Corps primarily because I'm bored, for lack of a better term. I want to be part of something, I want to do something serious. I want to be part of history. I don't think we're going to, one of the big things, Tarek, was I willingly, not on a conscious level, but I guess subconsciously, I understood the American history, but I viewed it as separate incidents. I wasn't willing to accept that we were part of the same trajectory of history, on the same line, the same path. So even the Gulf War, which had made me sick to my stomach, several years later, I'm able to say, well, that's not the way it's going to be anymore. That was a different era. And particularly when you're younger, time is different, right? And, but no, I mean, by the time the Iraq invasion comes and I'm in the Pentagon working in the Secretary of Navy's office, I was a White House liaison. I was the White House liaison officer for the Marine Corps. So because of that, I had to talk to nearly all the families of the Marines who were killed in the invasion. So the war became very personal very quickly. And then it gets into this aspect of you start lying to yourself, you start rationalizing about it, you start making excuses. When one lie doesn't add up anymore, you tell another lie. So when I go to Iraq my first time on that, as part of the U.S. Embassy, but as a DOD person, I'm thinking, well, this war at this point, it's April of 2004. I'm thinking this is completely F. This is terrible, but I'm thinking, well, in my immediate space, I can be a moral actor, which my first biggest mistake was thinking that you could be a moral actor in a war. The war is going to make you an agent of its actions, right? So, but you just lie to yourself continually. So by the time I get to Afghanistan, in addition to all the other stressors of war, the moral injury, the PTSD, had traumatic brain injury at that point, wasn't aware of it, but I probably did. You get to Afghanistan and I'm morally and intellectually broken. And I'm just hoping that the Afghan war is going to be different than the Iraq war. And it was pretty apparent quickly that no, it wasn't. And all the lies had tumbled. And so that's when I resigned. But I was morally and intellectually broken. There's no other way to describe it. And that led to, of course, suicidal aspirations, which I had already had before I even went to Afghanistan. By the time when I come home from my second Iraq deployment, I'm very suicidal at that point.
So, wow, thank you so much, Matt. So the disease was lying to oneself.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
absolutely.
You don't have that disease anymore.
Probably if you ask people around me, they'll probably say I do. You ask my ex-wife or something,
No,
but I mean, in a sense, yeah, I think that was a good diagnosis of it. But, we can get into a whole conversation about mendacity and war, right? We can have a whole conversation.
Yeah.
The whole thing is structured around lies, and it has to occur on the personal level. And whether the lie is knowing that it's wrong or just not acknowledging it or going along with something or not being willing to address it or look into it further, or then saying what I hear from my counterparts, guys who are still in the Marine Corps who agree with us about these things, it's the golden handcuffs. It's that, well, I'm a policy executor. I'm not a policy maker. That's above my pay grade. Or, you know what, I want to do it, but like I didn't want to get out because I'd be letting other guys down. And I know if those guys, if that colonel took Marines over to Afghanistan, he would get them killed. It's all those rationalizations that, and that's how these wars are sustained.
All right. Thank you, Tarek. Thank you, Matt. Matt, you're really courageous telling your story like that. I appreciate you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, and let's get our 4 questions in here before we have to wrap up. Let's call 9:30 quitting time here. Janet, go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you so much. Matt, I wanted to follow up on what Tarek was saying in a way, and to zero in on those crucial and so tragic years of 2004, 2005, when the American people were paying a lot more attention to war than unfortunately they are now, and it's especially with the explosive photos and other material that came out about torture of Iraqis. I mean, was there any way in which what civilian citizens in the United States were saying and doing in protest of the war and torture specifically, did that get through to you at all?
No, I think it was barely noticed. It was dismissed. Yeah, I'll tell you a story that trying to phrase this. Well, let me go back to the State Department stuff, because that's what we're here to talk about, and the lying with that and the selective understanding of the war. So when I was on the Iraq desk in 2005, after being in Iraq for a year, one of my jobs was I wrote, or I put together the weekly status report. There was both a classified and unclassified version that went to the president, went to the vice president every week, every Thursday, I think it was, or whenever it was. I would personally bring it up to the Secretary of State's office. And it also went to the media, went to members of Congress. And my week was spent trying to find lies about the Iraq war to make it look like it was going well, make it look like the progress. So I think we were very selective in what we were looking at. Same time, too, you had all that personal experience. You saw it, as well as reading, reading the intelligence, knowing what was going on. And I had this dissonance occurring all the time. But then, you want to be, there's various motivations that you have. You want to be part of the effort. You're part of the team. You don't want to let people down. You have friends who are over there. Your friends are going to go back. You want to be with them. Even though the whole thing is wrong, is immoral, is counterproductive, is not going to work. You still, there's all these different things. And then you get into other aspects, things that, particularly not proud of, the career aspects of it, right? The idea, and then you get to the point where you're so beaten down. For me, when I went to Afghanistan, it was, I can either die here in the US, I can either drink myself to death or work up the courage to shoot myself, or maybe I'll die over in Afghanistan. I'd rather do that. Right. So it was all that type of thing. But the civilian impact, the impact of the protests and everything else, it was dismissed. It was disregarded. These are people who don't know what they're talking about. And I think that was the thing that's most astounding to me joining the peace movement, is realizing that the people in the peace movement know more about this stuff than anyone else. I would put the knowledge of anyone in the peace movement, I would take a Medea Benjamin or, Anne Wright, of course, but and whatever, their understanding of geopolitics, and match them up against anyone else in Washington, D.C. any day. That's one thing I was so, I think, impressed by and didn't understand, that I came to understand, was the peace movement is full of people who know these things, who have the knowledge, they have the experience, they've been to these places. They're more courageous than most of us were who were in the military, right? But the other thing too is they have the wisdom. And there's a wisdom that exists within the peace movement, getting back to, say, John F. Kennedy's 1963 peace speech, right? Where peace is the necessary rational end of rational people, right? That understanding and the wisdom to have it and the courage to espouse it and live it.
Yeah. And did you, yeah, right. And did you want to add anything to that?
Nope, we said it all. Thank you. I will just say, I too was pretty impressed when I left the government and then came hesitantly into this thing called the peace movement. I was a little bit afraid of it, but scary
Right.
people in there that did know what they were talking about. So I agree with you, Matt.
Huh.
All right. Thank you, Janet. Appreciate it. And Evelyn, why don't you go right ahead?
Hi, thank you so much for your honesty and educating abilities. I'm just thinking about a DoD, Department of Diplomacy. How do we get there? I'd like to hear from both of you, please.
Well, we tried to get a Department of Peace when Dennis Kucinich was in, and you just keep working with your congressional delegation, keep putting these things forward, and writing articles about why don't we have a peace? Doesn't seem to be too diplomatic at times, but also encouraging the State Department to start identifying offices that work for peace. For example, there's no person that's dedicated that we know of to a ceasefire in Ukraine. There's no person that's dedicated. Well, the one that's dedicated on Yemen has been slowing down the process there. So we just have to keep after the government itself to reform itself.
Mm-hmm.
I think we have to take the money out of it as well. You have to nationalize these arms companies. You need to nationalize the arms industry, or the development industry, nationalize the intelligence industry, take the profit out of it, because otherwise it's the money's too good to be made off these wars. And again, to go back to JFK's 63 speech, he talks about how the pursuit of peace is not as dramatic as the pursuit of war, right? And understanding that, and I think that includes like the amount of money involved. So you see an organization, we have USIP, United States Institute of Peace, and they have been absolutely terrible these last 20 years. If you go and look what they've written about Afghanistan these last several months, they're basically, you read through the lines, they're saying we need to go and reinvade Afghanistan because, the Taliban got rid of opium. I mean, it's just madness, the things that they say. And that's the United States Institute of Peace. I mean, again, reading through the lines, I don't say it directly, but, so the corruption is something that we have to be very careful. And we see that, like this point of, the State Department abdicating its diplomatic role to be a part of the war machine.
Thank
All
you.
right. Thank you all. Let's see, Michael, is it Hoey? Please go ahead. Unmute yourself.
Yeah, so I want to go back to the democracy promotion, the development industry. And it seems like in some countries, like Poland, it's been somewhat successful establishing the rule of law, making Poland safe for foreign investment. Foreign investors have gone in there, created factories. And certain parts of Asia, it seems to have positives, but then you get countries like Russia and China that say your democracy promotion is trying to destabilize and overthrow our government. So I'm wondering, Matt, if you can compare and contrast when the development industry of democracy promotion actually achieves its goal and when what it's doing is counterproductive.
I mean, I certainly don't know the history that well, the development of these organizations, say like NED. I know NED was very involved in, say, Nicaragua, and defeating the Nicaraguan communist revolution and those sorts of things. And, so they've had that role for quite a while. I think, of course, we all see the value in sending our best and brightest people overseas to help people who need help where we can be of value. But the corruption of it into being an arm of our militarized foreign policy, I don't see how you fix that without getting rid of the militarized foreign policy. And that's certainly a topic for another webinar. But I think this idea of being able to help other people is something we all agree with. I think, like I said before, about converting our B-1s and B-2s and B-52s into fire engines as opposed to bombers, that would be something that would be beneficial for anyone around the world. We've got 5 B-2 bombers in Iceland right now, if people aren't aware of that, right? I mean, we're able to put these things all around the world to drop nuclear weapons, but where's the ability to do good? And but as long as we have this militarized foreign policy, I think we're going to have this problem. I want to hear Ann on this, though.
Yeah, I would just add that as long as countries go along with the United States, then and its policies, then democracy is fine. If it starts not going along with U.S. policies on war or something like that, then their democracy, God, it couldn't be a democracy. Otherwise, they would be going along with us. I mean, right now in Kyrgyzstan, the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee has written this astounding letter to the president of Kyrgyzstan saying, if you don't go along with our policy on Russia, essentially, we're going to do you in. And, I don't agree with Russia invading and attacking Ukraine at all, but to be blatant that if you don't do what we want on this thing, we will take all of our marbles and go home and do a little behind the scenes stuff at you, is essentially what Menendez is saying. And if you look at Cuba, you look at Iran, if you don't do what we say, we're going to do you in.
Yeah. Okay, we have, it's 9:28, so we're just about out of time, but we have one more person. William Ruth, if you can make a quick question, that'd be great.
Yes, I will make it a very quick question. I did follow the rules from your emails and wrote a 3-minute speech, which I can boil down to less than one. I emerged from World War II with a firm belief that people who fight those wars, the vast majority, don't want to be war heroes, they want to survive.
Mhm.
And the reason they want to survive is so that when they get out, they can work for peace rather than for another war. I then joined the State Department for 33 years, not because I agreed with its foreign policy for war making, which you heard all about tonight, but because of the reverse. I was naive. I thought I could change it from within. I was an advocate of searching for peace within the State Department. I failed. I did not find ways to find peace within the State Department, or for that matter, for the many years since I left the State Department, but I'm still searching for peace. But what I do think we should recognize is that empire, which is in the title of our webinar, is a fool's errand. There has never been and never will be a single nation who can rule the world as an empire. The Romans tried it, failed. Napoleon tried it, failed.
William, let me help. Let me ask you that. Do you have a question?
Yes, the question is, instead of trying to do all that, which we'll never accomplish, we should put all our eggs in the one basket of climate change. The clear, one of the biggest threat to national security right today, and for that matter, ever, is that the future of humanity on the planet is at stake if we do not stop consuming fossil fuels. And
Amen.
if we can
Amen.
simply forget about all other aspects of this and work on that, that's what I want to know whether the speakers agree.
All right.
Yeah,
Thank you.
see you September 17th in Washington or in New York City for the big march for the climate. Absolutely. And we look at all of the crap that the military industrial complex puts into our environment, screwing it up. I agree. And I think now we have 3 former diplomats here. So we've got to organize our Diplomats for Peace Association.
Good idea, Matt. So let's have a couple of you. Ann and Matt, do you have a couple final words and we can call it quits this evening?
Go ahead, Ann.
Yeah, well, mine is keep working. Don't let the nasty ones get us down on this. Thank you.
Yeah, mine's the same. You know, what you all are doing is so important. It's, you know, and if we fail, at least we go down swinging. But I think we've seen, you know, what William just said there about the climate and how we've seen this past week, how this is really going to be existential for us. It really is. And then, of course, we've seen these last 16 months. We just lost our friend Dan Ellsberg, you know, our greatest spokesperson about the dangers of nuclear weapons. And, you know, what have we been living through these last 16, 17 months with the war in Ukraine? It seems like a rehearsal for extinction. So if we go down, at least, if we fail, at least we go down swinging.
Thank you, Matt. That's right. So let me wrap up here for us. I'm going to put something in the chat that we posted before. It's our next WERN webinar is on September the 6th coming up. And this is the title of it is Selling War with China. And we have a Chinese American expert on American foreign policy. His name is Carl Jha. Maybe some of you have seen him. He's on a lot of talk shows and great analyst. And along with him is our friend, our Warren friend, and member of our group, our committee is Christian Sorensen. Will be joining us for that one as well. And he's going to be talking about the contracts that are going into the Defense Department aimed at weaponry for China. So that's our next one, September 6th, sorry. And then we have one on September 27th, and that one is called Buying Influence. And it's with Ben Freeman from the Quincy Institute, who's written a paper about the role of think tanks getting money from the Defense Department. And he's going to be with Dan Albel from Open Secrets, if you know Open Secrets. And he's going to be talking about lobbying, the money the Defense Department puts into lobbying. So those two together for the 27th, October the 18th, we're going to do, and I'll send you all this in writing. October the 18th, we're going to do one on the Merchants of Death War Crimes Tribunal. We've done one before, and Kathy Kelly and Bill Quigley did that for us. This time around, we're going to do Brad Wolf and Norman Solomon, and they have another person, Aisha Juman, who is going to be with us. We do have a fourth thing that's already been pre-recorded with Doug Valentine, if you know who he is, wrote a book called The CIA as Organized Crime. And he did a 40-minute interview with me about the role of the CIA in the empire. So that's pre-recorded. We'll do that too at some point when we can work it into our schedule. So thank you all for coming. This has been marvelous. Ann and Matt, you're the best. And thank you all for sticking with us. We had 160 people here tonight. So that's quite a showing. And we'll send out a follow-up email to our entire mailing list. We have like 1,800 people on our mailing list. It's been live streamed by Mass Peace Action. You can pick it up on YouTube. So until we meet again, you all, let's keep working for peace.
And Ann, if you could send the website where people can make donations for the Hawaiian disaster, we could send that out with the email that's going to go to everyone along with the recording of tonight's program.
I'll do that.
Yeah, send that to me, Ann. Thanks. All right. Good night, everyone. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you. Good night.